My name is Dr. Elias Marin, and for the past 14 years, I have served as the collections manager for the Antiquities Division at the Hawthorne Metropolitan Museum. That means I am responsible for cataloging, stabilizing, documenting, and safeguarding every ancient artifact that passes through our doors. Everything from clay tablets to funerary masks to the occasional, questionably legal private donation that falls off the back of a truck before being quietly appraised. I try not to ask too many questions. My job is to protect history, not judge the people who dig it up. Most people assume working in a museum is peaceful. They imagine quiet hallways, soft lighting, glass cases that never move. They don't think about the parts of the building no visitor ever sees. The conservation basements where humidity sits like a second skin. The narrow storage aisles where towering shelves swallow sound. The subterranean loading docks where artifacts arrive crated in anonymous wooden boxes marked only with custom stamps and warnings about fragility. They definitely don't imagine the late-night hours, when the mechanical hum of the HVAC becomes a pulse and every footstep echoes back at you like something is following just a half-second behind. This story happened over a single week, and officially, it was classified as a workplace incident involving environmental contamination and employee fatigue. That's the version written in our internal report, sanitized and approved by the board's legal team. But if someone were to ask me what really happened, what I really saw, and what I still hear sometimes when the museum settles after closing, I would say this: not everything buried in the ground should be brought back into the light. And some silence, once disturbed, does not settle again. It began on a Monday morning when a private shipment arrived from an excavation site in northern Jordan. The site lead, Dr. Khalid Rahim, had emailed me in advance with an unusual request. The crates were not to be opened by anyone except me, and they were to be stored in Isolation Bay C, not the standard intake bay. That alone raised my eyebrows. Isolation C is used only for items with known hazards: mold, toxins, unstable organic material. His message didn't include any of those red flags. Just a line: "You'll understand when you see it." The courier team wheeled in 2 crates, both large, both heavier than their manifests suggested. When we signed the paperwork, I noticed something odd. The crates weren't sealed with standard screws. They were bolted with industrial-grade hardware, the kind usually reserved for shipping dangerous chemicals. When I pointed this out, one courier shrugged and muttered, "We just pick up what they tell us." The other avoided eye contact entirely. I didn't open the crates immediately. Procedure required me to let them acclimate to room temperature to avoid condensation damage. So I logged them, checked the documentation packet, thin, barely 2 pages, and went about the rest of my tasks. But all day, I kept glancing toward the secure bay. Something about the shipment felt wrong. Heavy in a way that wasn't just physical. There are artifacts that carry emotional weight, things associated with death, burial, conflict. But this wasn't that. This felt like a pressure in the air, pushing outward, the way you feel approaching a sealed room that hasn't been opened in decades. By the time the museum closed, I was the last staff member still in the basement. I decided to open the first crate. The bolts resisted more than they should have, like they'd been tightened with unnecessary force, and when I finally pried the lid loose, a faint current of cold air brushed my face. Not freezing, just cold enough to make me blink. Inside was a stone container, rectangular, unadorned, not carved with symbols or reliefs, just smooth limestone, sealed with a black resin line around the lid. It looked like a sarcophagus, but smaller, maybe 4 feet long. Too small for a person. Too big for any ceremonial box I recognized. The documentation simply called it Object 47A. No origin note. No excavation depth. No cultural attribution. That alone made my stomach tighten. Every legitimate dig includes exhaustive context. Location. layer, composition, everything that helps researchers understand the artifact's world. But this file felt intentionally blank, like information had been removed. I leaned closer. The resin seal had been partially cracked on one corner, almost as if someone had tried to open it at the dig site and stopped, or been interrupted. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. There were plenty of natural reasons the seal might have fractured. Shifts in temperature, vibration from transport, dry resin aging poorly. But as I touched the edge of the limestone, I felt something I still can't fully explain. A faint vibration, subtle, almost like a heartbeat, not rhythmic, not alive, more like pressure equalizing between two spaces. Except the box was solid stone. I removed my hand immediately. I stepped back, breathed slowly, evaluated the logical explanations. The vibration could have come from the mechanical ductwork overhead, or from a passing freight truck outside, or from my own pulse traveling through my fingers. I wrote those possibilities in my log. I needed to ground myself in documentation. Logic is the scaffold that keeps fear from rewriting events. But even after noting them, I didn't believe any of the explanations, because the vibration had felt internal, like it came from within the stone. I sealed the crate again, logged the time, turned out the lights, but as I walked toward the elevator, the air behind me shifted, soft, like someone exhaling. I didn't turn around. I wish I had, because the next morning the second crate was open, and I know I didn't open it. The second crate shouldn't have been open. The bolts were on the ground, scattered, not unscrewed or neatly placed, just dropped, like someone had worked fast and didn't care about the noise. But the overnight logs showed nothing. No motion sensors tripped, no badge swipes, no maintenance alerts, no environmental changes. Nothing that explained how a sealed crate weighing nearly 400 pounds had been opened in a bay that was locked behind 2 layers of access control. I stood there staring at it, waiting for my mind to supply a rational chain of events. Maybe I had forgotten to lock the bay last night. Maybe a cleaning contractor had wandered down here. Maybe security did a walkthrough and didn't log it. But the moment I forced those explanations into place, they slid right back out, because the security feed across the hall should have shown anyone entering. Every angle of the corridor was covered. I checked the monitors immediately. No movement. Midnight to 6 a.m. was an uninterrupted string of still frames. Still, I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. The alternative was unacceptable. Inside the second crate was another stone object, but not a box. This one was more difficult to classify. It was roughly cylindrical, about waist-high, made of the same pale limestone as the first. But unlike the box, this surface had been carved. Not with images, those I could have understood, but with deep vertical grooves evenly spaced, running from top to bottom like someone pressed a comb the size of a human hand against wet stone. The grooves were so uniform they gave a strange sense of movement, as if the object were twisting even though it clearly wasn't. The documentation listed it as Object 47B. No notes, no analysis, just a single line of translation. Boundary marker. Boundary for what? Between what? There were no coordinates, no dig layer numbers, nothing to tie it to any known settlement or burial ground. Someone had intentionally stripped the context out of this paperwork. That wasn't unusual when dealing with private donors trying to conceal the true origin of an artifact. But this wasn't that situation. Dr. Rahim was a respected archaeologist. He didn't cut corners. He especially didn't violate documentation protocol. If anything, he over-documented everything. So why send 2 nameless, contextless stone objects across the world? I stepped closer to 47B. The stone felt cold. Not the normal coolness of limestone, but something deeper, like it hadn't acclimated at all overnight. When I placed the temperature probe against it, the reading made me frown. 46 degrees Fahrenheit. The storage bay was kept at 68. There was no refrigeration unit in the crate. No cold packs. Nothing that should have allowed the stone to stay that cold for 12 hours. I logged the anomaly, wrote the numbers down twice. I don't know why that made me feel safer, but it did. As I circled the object, I noticed something else. Thin dust lines on the floor. At first I thought they were from the crate itself, but when I crouched down, I realized the dust wasn't random. The lines were evenly spaced, just like the grooves carved into the stone, almost as if the cylinder had been rotated after removal from the crate. But that wasn't possible. This thing weighed at least 200 pounds. Nothing in the bay was disturbed. No scratches on the floor from dragging. No evidence that machinery had been used. And I certainly hadn't moved it. I told myself dust can settle strangely. Airflow from opening the crate might shift debris. But the lines were perfect semicircles. Layered. Progressive. Like something inside the crate had tried to turn. I forced that thought away so hard it gave me a headache. I convinced myself I was tired, that the long hours were catching up with me. Still, my hands shook as I photographed everything. When the department opened at 9, I tried calling Dr. Rahim. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail. At noon, I emailed him. 3, I called again. By 5 p.m., nothing. No reply, no read receipt. That wasn't like him. He was meticulous with communication. I considered escalating the concern to administration, but without knowing what I was escalating, I'd look unprofessional, paranoid, even, and realistically nothing had happened. A crate was open. Dust moved. A stone container vibrated. None of that made a formal incident. So I worked late again. Bad decision. At around 8:30 p.m., the building was quiet except for the compressors humming through the walls. I was cataloging 47 BS measurements when a faint sound drifted from the other side of the room. A click. Soft. Metal tapping metal. I froze. Another click. Then a scrape. It was coming from the first crate. Not the stone box itself, but the crate. A slow, almost tentative shuffle of wood against tile, as if the crate were settling. Except crates don't shift after sitting all day. Not without vibration. And there was none. The air felt completely still. I walked toward it, every step echoing louder than it should have. The crate sat exactly where I'd left it, bolts reinstalled, though I had tightened them only by hand. I used my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the surface. No movement. Then something tapped the inside wall. Faint, hollow knock. I didn't breathe. Came again. Slightly louder. The kind of sound you get when someone uses their knuckle against a wooden door, testing how thick it is. My throat dried instantly. A dozen logical possibilities slammed into each other in my mind. Thermal expansion of the wood. Trapped air pockets. Settling of internal supports. But none of them matched the cadence. The taps weren't random. They had spacing. Intention. I pressed my hand against the crate. It was cold. Not the artifact. The crate. Wood doesn't hold cold like that. The knock came again, directly under my palm. I pulled my hand away so fast my fingers ached. I backed up, heart pounding, waiting for another noise. Waiting for anything to explain what I'd just felt. But the room went still. Unnaturally still, as if the moment I stepped away, whatever had been moving decided it no longer needed to. That was when my phone buzzed. An email. From Dr. Rahim. Timestamp. 8:41 p.m. Subject line. Do not open 47A. No message body. Just an attachment. A single audio file named Before We Sealed It. I didn't play it. Not yet. because the last line of his original email flashed through my mind. "You'll understand when you see it." Now I wasn't sure I wanted to. I stared at the audio file on my phone for a long time before finally slipping the device into my pocket. I wasn't ready to hear whatever was inside it. Not yet. Not while standing alone in a basement filled with objects I didn't understand. Not while the crate that shouldn't have opened itself was cold enough to sting my skin. The museum had grown unnervingly quiet. Not the natural quiet of after hours, where the HVAC hums like a white noise blanket, but a heavier kind. A kind where every small noise becomes a point of tension. My breathing sounded too loud. My footsteps felt amplified. Even the clicking of my pen when I fidgeted with it seemed intrusive. I forced myself back to my workstation. I needed structure, logic, documentation. Without those, my mind was going to create monsters out of wood and stone. I pulled up the intake form for Object 47A and Object 47B again, hoping I had missed something. A footnote, a forgotten metadata tag, anything that would make sense of how the second crate opened without anyone touching it. There was nothing. I finally opened Dr. Rahim's email again, reading the subject line over and over. "Do not open 47A. Not don't open yet. Not don't open until I arrive." Just a categorical, absolute directive. Why send me something I'm forbidden to examine? Why ship an artifact across the world only to tell me not to touch it? And what did the audio file contain? My fingers hovered over the play icon. For a moment I thought about unplugging the speakers, using headphones instead. That felt safer, more controlled. It would also make me far more isolated. In the end, I closed the app entirely. I told myself I wasn't procrastinating. I was prioritizing safety. There were protocols for handling unidentified artifacts. Maybe the audio contained sensitive field information that needed a controlled environment. Maybe it wasn't meant for immediate review. But deep down, I knew that was an excuse. I didn't want to know what sound came from inside that stone box. I needed to get out of the basement. Not because I was afraid, at least that's what I told myself, but because fatigue makes professionals sloppy. And sloppy work ruins irreplaceable artifacts. So I shut down my workstation, locked the bay doors, double-checked the security panel, and walked toward the elevator. Before I reached it, the lights flickered. Just once. Barely half a second. But long enough for the darkness to swallow the room and spit it back out. The emergency generator didn't kick in. The power stabilized immediately. Still, the flicker made me stop in my tracks. In all my years at the museum, I could count on one hand the number of electrical disruptions strong enough to dim the basement lights. The wiring was industrial. Redundancies were everywhere. Flickers didn't happen. Unless something drew power. Something heavy. I forced myself to keep walking. The elevator opened before I pressed the button. That made me pause again. The sensors were finicky sometimes, but this felt too perfectly timed. I stepped inside, hit the button for the lobby, and leaned against the back wall. The elevator started moving, then stopped. Not abruptly, no jolt, no mechanical groan. Just a soft halt between floors. I checked the panel. No error lights. No alarms. The digital floor display froze on B2. We were halfway to B1. For a moment, I wondered if I should pry open the doors. But rationality, blessed, grounding rationality, told me no. The museum's elevator system had redundancies. It would reboot. Maintenance would get an alert. I just needed to wait. Except the elevator suddenly felt cold. Not the metallic coolness of a steel box with air conditioning. A deeper cold. The same cold as the crate. My hand drifted toward the emergency call button. Then my phone buzzed. A new email. From the museum's internal alert system. Seismic sensor triggered. Isolation Bay C. I stared at the screen. The warning didn't make sense. The seismic sensors were vibration detectors used to protect fragile artifacts. They rarely triggered, and when they did, the alert included the magnitude. This one didn't. Just the location. Isolation Bay C. The room with both artifacts. The elevator hummed softly and resumed moving on its own. When it reached the lobby, the doors opened with a tone that sounded louder than usual. I stepped out, breathing harder than I wanted to admit, and walked to the nearest guard station. The night shift guard, Santiago, glanced up from his tablet. "Long day, Doc." I nodded. "Can you check something for me?" Isolation Bay C got a seismic alert. He frowned and pulled up the feed. Weird. No movement registered. Sensors tripped, but cameras didn't pick up anything. "Can I see?" He angled the monitor toward me. The bay appeared perfectly still. Crates, tables, stone objects. No sign of disturbance. Except there was a shadow on the far wall. Faint shape, almost like a silhouette cast by something just out of frame. But when I checked the overhead view, nothing was near that wall. "Probably a glitch," Santiago said. "Probably. But I didn't believe that. Shadows don't glitch. They appear because something blocks light." Still, I forced a smile, thanked him, and headed toward the exit. Outside, the night air felt warm compared to the museum's cold, heavy atmosphere. I unlocked my car, got inside, and sat there for several minutes without turning the key. Then curiosity finally overpowered caution. I plugged in my headphones, opened Dr. Rahim's email, tapped the audio file. A wave of static filled my ears, sharp and distorted. Then voices, distant, muffled. Men speaking Arabic, their words hurried, anxious. I couldn't make out most of it, but I recognized one phrase repeated twice. "Don't lift it again." Then there was a scraping sound, stone against stone, followed by something else. A low, resonant tone. Not a voice, not machinery, not anything I could categorize. A vibration, slow, pulsing. The same vibration I felt through the stone in Isolation Bay C. The recording cut abruptly. My mouth went dry. My pulse hammered in my neck. I replayed the last 15 seconds twice, 3 times, trying to find a rational explanation. A loose microphone, structural settling, excavation equipment, but nothing fit. That tone wasn't mechanical. It wasn't environmental. It sounded deliberate. I sat in the car for nearly an hour before finally driving home. I slept poorly, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dust rings around 47B. Not random, not accidental, concentric, as if something heavy had turned slowly, patiently, waiting for someone to notice. I returned to the museum early the next morning, earlier than necessary, because the idea of those artifacts sitting in Isolation Bay C without supervision gnawed at me. I told myself it was professional responsibility, but the truth was simpler. I didn't trust what I had seen, and I trusted what I had felt even less. The vibration in the stone, the knock from inside the crate, the cold that seemed to cling to anything associated with Object 47A. When I swiped into the basement level, the air was noticeably different. Not colder, just denser, as if the humidity regulators were off by a few points, thickening the space enough for my breath to feel heavier. I checked the environmental panel as I passed it. Everything was in the green, yet the density didn't go away. My keycard beeped against the Isolation C door. When the lock disengaged, the mechanism sounded louder than usual, metallic and strained. I hesitated before pushing the door open, half expecting something impossible. An overturned table, a cracked container. A crate moved from where I'd left it, but everything appeared normal, normalish, because the dust rings around Object 47B weren't the same as yesterday. There were more, at least 2 additional arcs, faint but visible under directional light. Maybe someone had walked through, dragging debris. Maybe ventilation drafts had stirred the dust. But the pattern was too perfect, too smooth. Air doesn't make arcs like that, and human feet don't make evenly spaced semicircles around a fixed object. I walked to the center of the bay, crouched, and brushed a fingertip across one of the new arcs. It was fresh. The dust still shifted like loose powder instead of compacting from time. My first instinct was to check the motion logs. I pulled up the terminal. No entries from overnight. No vibration spikes. No environmental fluctuations. But the dust didn't lie. Something had moved. Not much. Not violently. But undeniably. I turned toward Object 47A, the sealed stone box. It sat exactly where I'd left it, bolts tightened. I hovered a hand near it, not touching, just testing the air. Cold radiated from its surface again. Think rationally, I told myself. Temperature differentials can persist. Stone has slow thermal exchange. The crates might have acted like insulation. Nothing supernatural. Nothing unusual. But the cold wasn't diminishing. I placed the temperature probe on its surface. 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Even colder than yesterday. That made no sense at all. I removed the probe, logged the reading, stared at the stone box for a long moment, trying to decide whether Rahim's warning was based on actual hazard, superstition, or panic. I could imagine scenarios where opening an unknown container released trapped spores or ancient bacteria. That was realistic. That was my domain. But nothing about this stone box suggested biological contamination. No organic residues. No porous interior. No indication it had held anything perishable. Unless the danger wasn't inside the box, but the box itself. A chime sounded behind me, sudden and sharp. I nearly jumped. It was my work tablet on the table. A notification banner slid across the screen. Preliminary acoustic analysis completed. I frowned. I hadn't initiated any acoustic analysis. Then I realized the file must have automatically synced from my phone overnight. The museum's cloud storage sometimes did that with incoming project data, which meant the audio file labeled "before we sealed it" had been run through our sound analysis software. My stomach tightened. I tapped the notification. The waveform appeared on the screen, peaks and valleys of static and muffled voices. But the software had isolated the low-frequency tone, the one that matched the vibration I had felt. Frequency: 18.3 hertz. My hands went numb. That number wasn't arbitrary. 18 hertz is known as an infrasound frequency, below the range of human hearing, often associated with physiological effects. Anxiety, unease, the sense of a presence in the room. Some studies suggest prolonged exposure can induce hallucinations or a feeling of being watched. That explanation should have calmed me, should have given me a clear, rational anchor. Except for one detail. Infrasound usually requires a source, machinery, turbines, storms, or pressure changes. Something external. But in the excavation recording, the tone was internal. Localized. The microphone picked it up as if it came directly from the stone container. Stone doesn't generate infrasound. At least not naturally. I replayed the isolated sample through the analysis software. This time, I heard it clearly. A rumbling presence beneath the static. Not a voice. Not a machine. Just a low, pulsing vibration. The moment it played, the lights in isolation bay C flickered again. Just like last night. Coincidence? Had to be. Electrical load fluctuations. Corroded fixtures. But they had passed inspection last week. Every fixture. Every ballast. The vibration was still playing when a sound rose behind it. A soft scrape. Stone shifting on tile. I whipped around. Object 47B, the carved cylinder, tilted a fraction of an inch, then stopped. It had moved. I stared, frozen. My mind tried to assemble explanations. Floor unevenness, vibration resonance. my own eyes misreading. But none of them held. The movement was too controlled, too precise, a deliberate tilt like someone nudged it from below. The vibration file ended. Silence swallowed the room. I approached 47B slowly, feeling the air thicken around me. When I reached it, I placed my palm gently against the stone. Warm, not hot, not even room temperature. Warm. Limestone should never feel like living skin. I jerked my hand back, breath catching, and that was when my phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I answered without checking the caller ID. "Dr. Marin," a voice said immediately, strained, breathless. "Do not stay near the artifacts. Do not stay in that room." It was Dr. Rahim. His voice trembled. "Tell me what's happening," I said. "Tell me what these objects are." "You need to evacuate the bay," he insisted. "Do it now. I am already on a flight. I will be there by the morning. But do not, under any circumstances, let the seal on 47A be disturbed." "It isn't disturbed," I said. "The bolts are in place." The seal looked intact. "Looked." His voice cracked. "You looked? Do not touch it. Do not attempt to move it. Do not let anyone near it." I swallowed hard. "What is inside, Rahim?" There was a long pause on the line. Then, quietly, "We don't know." A click. Call ended. I lowered my phone slowly. I stared at the sealed stone box. And for the first time, I noticed something I had missed before. A thin line of resin dust, running down one corner, like the seal had shifted microscopically since yesterday. The box wasn't fully sealed anymore. Not anymore. I stared at the resin dust for a long time, trying to convince myself I was misreading it. The lighting in Isolation Bay C could exaggerate details. Dust could fall from the ventilation ducts. The crate might have shifted from minor vibrations. But denial only works when the evidence isn't looking right back at you. The resin line had changed. Only slightly, a hairline fracture along the edge, but I knew it hadn't been there yesterday. My logs included high-resolution close-ups. I checked them again on my tablet, zooming in frame by frame. No fracture, no dust, no sign that the seal had ever been compromised. But now it was. The next step should have been straightforward. Flag the artifacts, shut down the bay, call administration, declare a hazard. That was protocol. But my brain kept sticking on Rahim's voice. The panic threaded under every word. "Do not stay near the artifacts. Do not let the seal be disturbed. We don't know what's inside." If he truly didn't know, then why did he sound like someone begging me not to open a cage? I forced myself to breathe slowly and pulled up the museum's archive system. If the official documentation had been stripped, maybe the digital trail would show something. Metadata from the excavation, encrypted attachments, anything left behind during the upload process. I opened the accession record for Object 47A, then frowned. The digital file had been updated 12 hours ago by someone using an external IP. I opened the edit log. One entry. No description. No username. Just a string of numbers, coordinates, except not in a standard format. I rewrote them into degrees, minutes, seconds. They pointed to the excavation site, or rather, the perimeter surrounding it. A perimeter exactly 4 meters wider than the site should have been. I knew enough archaeology to recognize a red flag. Perimeter expansion without documentation meant the dig had uncovered something outside the expected settlement boundaries. Something the team didn't want recorded properly. I scrolled further. The metadata contained a hidden attachment. Encrypted. That alone wasn't unusual. Confidential files, internal notes, donor restrictions. But the encryption key wasn't one used by our museum system. It was a military-grade cipher, and that set every alarm in my head screaming. Why would an archaeology dig encrypt something like that? I tried a few standard decoding sequences, nothing. The file stayed locked. I leaned back, rubbing my eyes, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. It felt like standing too close to an open doorway when you can't see what's inside. Another seismic alert chimed. Isolation Bay C. Low frequency detected. I exhaled sharply. That wasn't a seismic alert. That was the system interpreting infrasound as vibration again. The tone from the recording. But the speakers in the bay were silent. No audio was playing. The infrasound was coming from the room itself. I checked the environmental panel. Decibel levels fluctuated subtly, dipping into the 18 to 20 Hz band. That shouldn't be possible. Museums are designed to minimize low-frequency interference. There were no turbines here, no industrial machinery, no pressure waves. Yet the sensor graph climbed again. Another pulse. Another. The air seemed to thicken with each one. I forced myself toward the crate containing 47A. I wasn't going to touch it, just inspect. Just confirm the fracture hadn't widened further. My heart hammered as I approached, the infrasound pressing faintly against my ribs. When I reached the crate, something caught my eye. A fingerprint. Not mine. Not dust. A clear print left on the side of the crate, oily, smudged, but unmistakably human. I checked the logs again. No one had access. No badge entries. Not even security. So either someone got in without using the door, or they were already in the room when I arrived this morning. That thought hit me harder than the infrasound. I scanned the crate carefully. The fingerprint wasn't the only thing. The bolts were still in place, but the top left corner had shifted upward, barely a millimeter. Just enough to angle the seam and let the resin dust spill. I told myself wood swells. Metal loosens. But I didn't believe it. Another pulse shook the air. This one stronger. Louder in a way that wasn't sound but pressure. An ache in the eardrums. A vibration you feel more than hear. I stepped back from the crate. Another pulse. The lights flickered. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay grounded. This is explainable, I kept repeating. Everything has a cause. Infrasound can create hallucinations. Light flickers with electrical load changes. Fingerprints come from contamination. Dust shifts. Stone moves from temperature gradients. Then the movement happened again. Object 47B shifted. Not much. Not dramatically. Just a tiny rotation, barely a quarter of a degree. But it was real. The shadow it cast changed shape. The dust at its base stirred. The stone's grooves caught the light at a slightly different angle. I froze. The rotation was too smooth to be accidental. No vibration from the floor. No air pressure change. No footsteps creating tremors. The motion matched the dust arcs from the previous days. Patient. Incremental. Waiting. My throat tightened. The infrasound droned deeper, resonating through the walls. I turned toward the exit, but my tablet chimed again. Another hidden file had appeared in the accession log. Not encrypted this time, just a series of photographs. I opened the first one. A dig pit. Workers standing around a stone slab. Their faces blurred, motion, not censorship. They looked like they were pulling back suddenly, startled. I opened the second. The stone slab was cracked. Not broken, cracked. A thin line running across its center. I opened the third. There was a handprint on the inside surface of the slab. Pressed outward. Human-shaped. Clear. Deep enough to compress the limestone. My tablet slipped slightly in my grip. No one on earth can press a hand into stone. Not without tools. Not from the inside. I opened the fourth image. A close-up of the slab after they sealed it again. The caption beneath the photo read, "Do not open. Pressure is structural, not biological." Structural, not biological. That should have been comforting. That meant no organism, no contamination, no ancient pathogen. But the handprint, the rotation arcs, the infrasound, my eyes drifted involuntarily toward Object 47A. The fracture along the resin seal had widened. Barely, but enough. Enough to show that the stone lid was not resting flat anymore. It was lifting, slowly, quietly, millimeter by millimeter, as if something inside was adjusting to the pressure, or testing the boundary. I should have evacuated the room, locked it, reported the anomaly, walked away, but the fracture along the seal was all I could look at. A gap the width of a fingernail. Too small for anything to emerge, too large for my mind to ignore. The infrasound pulse grew deeper, a low resonance pressing against my sternum, as if my heartbeat were sinking to something external, something steady, something patient. I forced myself backward until my shoulders hit the metal shelving along the wall. The contact shocked me into movement. I left Isolation Bay C, sealed it, and activated the secondary access lock. Then I headed straight to the environmental engineering office 2 floors up. If the infrasound was real, and not just an artifact of equipment malfunction, there would be logs. The engineer on duty, a young guy named Connor, looked up from his desk. "Morning, Dr. Marin. You look, not great. I need to see the acoustic logs for the basement levels," I said. My voice came out flatter than I intended. He blinked. "For what range?" 18 to 20 hertz. His posture stiffened. "That's an oddly specific request. Please." He hesitated, long enough for me to realize he knew something. He pulled up the logs anyway, tapping through screens until we reached yesterday's timeline. Then today's. Then the real-time display. The graph spiked immediately. 18.3 hertz. Sustained. Pulsing every 4.7 seconds. Connor frowned. "That's not the HVAC system. What else could create that frequency? A turbine, a servo failure, pressure imbalance, standing waves from mechanical resonance. But if it were any of those, we'd be getting structural warnings, or at least vibration feedback. And we're not. So what's causing it?" He exhaled slowly. "Honestly, I don't know. We can run a directional analysis." I nodded. He activated the directional sensors. 4 lines appeared on the screen, each representing acoustic input from a different quadrant of the basement. 3 were flat. 1 was rising. "Source is in Isolation Bay C," Connor said quietly. I swallowed. "It shouldn't be." He glanced at me. "Are you storing something new down there?" 2 stone artifacts from a dig site in Jordan. He processed that. "Stone doesn't generate infrasound." "I'm aware." Another pulse hit. The lights in the engineering office flickered. Connor's head snapped upward. "That shouldn't happen either." "No," I said. "It shouldn't." He zoomed in on the wave profile. "This pattern is too rhythmic. Almost like a pressure equalization cycle." "Between what and what?" I asked. "The room and something under it," he said. "Except there's nothing under the bay except concrete." A shiver crawled up my neck. He leaned closer to the monitor. "And there's something else." He tapped a point on the graph. "The frequency is slightly modulating. That's not natural resonance. Something's adjusting." Adjusting. The word landed like a weight. "Look," he continued. "I'm going to request a full structural scan, but it'll take an hour for the system to run. You should probably clear out of that area until we know what's going on." I nodded, but my feet felt rooted. "Dr. Marin," he said, softer now. "Seriously, you look pale." "I'm fine," I lied. His eyes drifted to the rising acoustic line. He didn't believe me. I left the office and walked back toward the basement elevator. But as I reached the stairwell, 2 security officers rounded the corner, talking quietly. I recognized one, Santiago from the night shift. "Telling you I heard something," he was saying. "Like metal straining." His partner shook his head. "Feed looks normal." "Yeah, but audio doesn't pick up subsonic frequencies." I stopped walking. Santiago noticed me. Document. You heading downstairs? I need to check something. You might want to wait, he said. Maintenance is getting weird readings from the sensors. Like the floor plates are flexing, but only a tiny amount. Flexing. Thermal expansion seems unlikely, he added, looking uneasy. Temperature down there hasn't changed. A pulse thudded through the hallway. Barely perceptible, just a faint shift in pressure. The lights dimmed for less than a second. All three of us exhaled at the same time. I'll go with you, Santiago said. I shook my head. It's better if I go alone. Man, no offense, he replied. But this feels like the start of a lawsuit, and I'd like you alive enough to testify when it happens. Despite the tension, a strained laugh escaped me. Fine, but don't enter the bay without my say. We headed down the stairs. The deeper we went, the thicker the air felt. Not colder, just heavier, like walking into an underpressurized cabin. When we reached the basement hallway, the infrasound pulse hit again. Not loud, but forceful enough that Santiago rubbed his ear. Jesus, he muttered. Feels like a migraine trying to crawl out. I unlocked the corridor leading to the isolation bays. A vibration traveled through the metal railing under my palm. Not shaking, more like the faint hum of an engine starting somewhere far beneath us. But there was nothing beneath us. No tunnels, no machinery, just reinforced concrete. We stopped outside Bay C. The overhead camera's indicator light blinked erratically. Santiago tapped his radio. Control? Do you have eyes on C? Static answered. He frowned. They're not hearing me. I placed my hand near the bay door. Not touching, just hovering an inch above the metal. Cold radiated from the seam. The same cold as the crate. The same cold from yesterday. Not ambient. Not environmental. Localized. Okay, Santiago said quietly. I'm officially freaked out. I unlocked the first-level security latch, but before I touched the second, a faint sound slipped through the doorframe. A scrape. Soft. Measured. Stone against tile. Another scrape. Then a pause. Then a low, rhythmic thud. Like something heavy shifting its weight and setting itself down. I stepped back instinctively. Santiago's hand hovered near his holster, even though bullets would be useless against whatever this was. The thud repeated. Slow. Deliberate. In time with the infrasound pulse. Then it stopped. Silence pooled under the door. Not empty silence. Waiting silence. Something inside the bay had moved. Not violently. Not chaotically. Moved like it had purpose. Then my phone buzzed. A text message. Unknown number. Do not open the door. It senses pressure changes. My mouth went dry. Before I could respond, another message came. If the seal is compromised, it will continue adjusting until equilibrium is reached. Do not let it reach equilibrium. Another. I am 6 hours away. Stall it. Do whatever you have to. Just stall it. Rahim. Santiago glanced at me. What's wrong? I stared at the messages, pulse pounding. Something inside that room, I said slowly, is trying to equalize pressure. With what? He asked. I lifted my eyes to the door. The resin fracture. The tilt of 47B. The rhythmic pulses. The stone shifting. The handprint from the inside of the slab. With us? I whispered. With us? I repeated, barely able to force the words out. The hallway suddenly felt too narrow, the air too dense. Santiago kept his hand near his holster out of instinct, but whatever was behind the door didn't care about weapons. Cared about pressure. Pressure equalization. A term for environments that respond to imbalance. A system seeking balance. But how could a sealed stone box, one without moving parts, without internal machinery, detect pressure changes outside itself? The door vibrated softly under a new pulse of infrasound. Not enough to shake visibly, but enough for the hair on my arms to rise. Santiago stepped closer, lowered his voice. Doc, what exactly is in there? I wished more than anything that I had an answer. 2 stone artifacts. 1 sealed container. 1. I hesitated. 1 object showing signs of movement. You mean it's alive? No, I said immediately, too quickly. No, nothing biological. It's a misinterpretation. It has to be. The infrasound is causing weird perception effects. You mean making us hallucinate? It's possible, I said. Prolonged exposure can create the sensation of movement, presence. Another scrape echoed from behind the door. Not imagined. Not an auditory distortion. A real physical scrape. Stone shifting across a hard surface. Santiago swore under his breath. That wasn't a hallucination. No, it wasn't. I forced myself to stay rational, to cling to explanations that fit within the bounds of physics and archaeology. Connor's analysis suggested the pulses were structural. Maybe the artifacts are responding to tension in the environment. That sounds like a polite way of saying they're reacting. Reacting isn't the same as acting, I said. A pressure differential could cause microshifts, even rotation. Even as I said it, I didn't believe it, because the movement wasn't random or directionless. It was incremental, consistent, and timed with the pulses. I checked my phone again. Raheem's messages sat on the screen like warnings carved into stone. Do not let it reach equilibrium. If equilibrium meant the internal pressure matching the external environment, then the artifact needed the seal to open further. Slowly, gradually, purposefully, Santiago must have seen something in my expression. What do we do? I didn't answer immediately. Every scenario I considered ended with the same conclusion. The bay had to stay closed. We had to prevent any increase in atmospheric exchange between the artifact and the room. But something didn't make sense. Why pressure? Why vibration? Why such controlled micro-movement? I stepped to the wall console beside the door. I'm going to check the internal environmental readings. Can you do that without opening the room? Yes. The internal sensors are separate from the physical lock. I pulled up the panel. The numbers flickered for a second before stabilizing. Temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity, 43%. Atmospheric pressure, 14.61 psi. That was the standard pressure for the basement level. I scrolled down. Atmospheric pressure, localized 14.41 psi. My stomach dropped. Localized pressure readings came from microsensors placed around specific artifacts, usually to detect leaks in containers or airflow patterns near sensitive items. The pressure near Object 47A was lower than the room. Not equal, lower, meaning the container wasn't just reacting to outside pressure. It was exerting its own. Santiago leaned in. Why are there two readings? One is the room pressure, I said. The other is the pressure near the artifact. So the room isn't influencing it? No, I murmured. It's influencing the room. A new pulse thudded from inside the bay, stronger than before. The door's metal frame popped sharply, like a lid of a jar being stressed from inside. Santiago stepped back. Document tell me this place isn't gonna blow up. It won't explode, I said. Stone can't produce the necessary force. That sentence didn't feel as reassuring as I meant it to. I tapped further into the sensor logs. Historically, they should be flat, static. Artifacts don't breathe. They don't expand or contract in rhythmic pulses. But the graph wasn't flat. 7 hours ago, 14.57 psi. 5 hours ago, 14.52 psi. 2 hours ago, 14.48 psi. 1 hour ago, 14.44 psi. Now, 14.41 psi. The pressure near the container was dropping in slow, steady intervals, as if the artifact were a sealed vessel with negative pressure inside it, pulling the air toward itself. But that was impossible. Stone doesn't create vacuum gradients. Not naturally. Not artificially without machinery. What happens when it reaches the room pressure? Santiago asked quietly. Equilibrium. Raheem's warning. The pulse hit again. Louder. More deliberate. I felt it in my teeth. Behind the door, something scraped with far more weight than before, like a heavy object dragging slightly. The sound was slow, Purposeful. Positional shift, not a random wobble. Santiago stiffened. Doc, whatever is in there, it's getting bolder. No, I said. It's getting closer. To what? The pressure logs answered for me. The interval was shrinking. It was adjusting faster now, as if aware of resistance. Suddenly, the environmental display flashed red. Pressure change detected. Localized drop. 14.38 psi. A drop that fast meant a breach. A small one, but enough for the internal pressure to pull the surrounding air inward. My pulse hammered. That meant the seal had lifted more. I turned to the door. I need to reduce the ambient pressure around the artifact. Stall it. How? Increasing room pressure would slow the exchange, I said. The differential won't let it equalize as quickly. You can do that? Yes, but I have to open the auxiliary control panel inside. Santiago stared at me, eyes wide. Inside the room? It's the only way. Another pulse hit the door. This time the vibration carried through the floor. Doc, he said carefully. You go in there, you might not come back out. I wiped my palms on my lab coat. If we let it equalize, whatever it's adjusting for will finish adjusting. A long silence stretched between us. Then Santiago squared his shoulders. If you're going in, I'm going with you. No, I said. You can't. The hell I can't. You need to stay outside. I held his gaze. If something goes wrong, someone has to lock the door. He hesitated, then nodded. Once, I took a deep breath, reached for the lock, and opened the door to Isolation Bay C. The door to Isolation Bay C opened no more than 8 inches before the pressure difference pushed back. Not violently, just a steady resistance, as if the room were inhaling. The air brushing past my face felt colder than before, carrying a faint mineral scent, like damp limestone after rain. I slipped inside. The moment the door closed behind me, the infrasound pulse deepened. Not louder, just closer, like standing too near a subwoofer humming at a frequency just below hearing. My chest vibrated faintly with every cycle. Santiago's muffled voice drifted through the door. Doc? You good? I'm fine, I lied. Don't open the door unless I tell you. The bay was dimmer than it should have been. Overhead lights flickered at inconsistent intervals, never fully going out but never stabilizing long enough for my eyes to settle. The 2 artifacts sat where they had before or close enough. Object 47B, the carved cylinder, had rotated again. Not much, maybe 3 degrees, but enough for the newest dust arc to be visibly displaced. Each groove cut into its surface shimmered under the unstable lights, creating an illusion of movement even when the stone was perfectly still. At least, I hoped it was still. Object 47A sat in its crate like a block of winter caught in mid-breath. The cold radiating from it in waves made the air feel stratified, layers of temperature gradients where fog should have formed but didn't. The resin fracture was larger, not catastrophically, just enough for me to see a slightly darker line between the lid and the body of the container. A gap, hair-thin but unmistakable. Pressure exchange. I forced myself to focus. I needed to reach the auxiliary control panel. It was located behind the shelving unit on the far wall. 20 feet away. Just a short walk, if not for the fact that every instinct in my body was screaming to get out. The infrasound pulse struck again. This time, a small metallic clang echoed from the opposite corner of the bay. I turned sharply. A stainless steel tray had fallen from a workbench. Not rolled, not tipped. It had fallen straight down, as if the vibration hit only that exact point. Focus, Elias. I skirted the edge of the room, keeping distance from both artifacts. My steps felt heavy, like the air thickened around my legs. I had read countless papers about the physiological effects of infrasound, balance disruption, vertigo, pressure illusions. But knowing the mechanisms didn't help when your body responded with primal fear. Halfway across the room, I heard a soft, granular shift. Dust moving. Not from ventilation. Not from footsteps. From rotation. Object 47B turned another fraction of a degree. Deliberate. Measured. Timely. I didn't look directly at it again. The auxiliary panel stood recessed into the wall, behind a protective plastic cover. I flipped it open, fingers stiff from the cold, and began adjusting the atmospheric controls. Increasing the pressure was simple in theory. Engage the pump, shift the gradient, restrict the outflow. But nothing in this room wanted to cooperate. The pump stuttered. The vents rattled. The pressure indicators blinked uncertainly. Still, the numbers rose on the display. 14.41 psi, 14.51, 14.59. The infrasound waned slightly. Encouraged, I adjusted the next valve. The lights flickered harder. Another pulse hit. But this one wasn't just vibration. It carried a tangible shift in the air, a brief drop in temperature across the entire bay. Behind me, something thudded softly. I turned. The crate containing Object 47A had moved. Not far, maybe an inch, but the crate weighed hundreds of pounds. There was no airflow strong enough to move it. No vibration intense enough. No mechanical reason. The pressure inside the crate was pulling. I reached for the control to increase pressure one more level, hoping it would slow the exchange. The panel flickered. Warning lights lit up. Error. Pressure instability. Then the localized pressure reading, tied to the microsensors around 47A, updated in real time. 14.41 psi, 14.44, 14.47, 14.50. No, I whispered. It wasn't slowing down. It was adjusting its own rate, matching the artificial increase I introduced. It was learning. Another pulse struck. This one so strong I had to grab the shelving to steady myself. The infrasound dug into my bones, vibrating behind my eyes. The resin seal along the container's edge cracked audibly. I froze. The lid shifted upward so slightly I might have missed it if not for the sound. Tiny, grainy creak. A whisper of stone against stone. Then the cold intensified, sharper, more directed, like the release of air from a vacuum-sealed chamber. I staggered back. The lid dropped back down. Not fully, just enough to rest again. A breath. A test. I didn't realize I was shaking until my knee hit the metal cabinet. Santiago's voice shouted faintly through the door, muffled but urgent. "Doc!" The pressure outside just spiked. "What's going on in there?" I forced myself toward the door, but halfway across the bay, the overhead lights went black. Total darkness. Not dim, not flickering. Gone. The infrasound surged, like a presence spreading through the room, pressing from all sides simultaneously. My throat tightened. My ears popped. I dropped to one knee instinctively, bracing against the floor. The artifacts were moving. I couldn't see them. I didn't need to. I felt the shift through the tile. A scrape. A rotation. A low, internal groan of stone compressing under strain. I crawled blindly toward where I remembered the door to be, hands shaking violently. Panic clawed at my ribs, but panic wouldn't get me out. I needed the latch. 3 feet more. 2. 1. My palm hit metal. I pounded on the door. "Santiago! Open it!" Something behind me shifted again. A heavy object pivoting, repositioning. Waiting. The infrasound pulse hit one more time, and the lights flickered back on. Enough for me to see it. Object 47, as lid had lifted a full quarter-inch, and the cold spilling from the opening condensed into a faint mist across the crate. Not gas, not vapor, pressure, leaking, equalizing. "Open it!" I yelled. The door unlocked. Light flooded in. I stumbled out as Santiago grabbed my arm, pulling me clear. The moment the door closed behind us, something inside thudded against the wall. Hard. Not random. Directed. The pressure log on the hallway panel updated. 14.61 psi, 14.61 psi, 14.41 psi, 14.60 psi. The numbers were matching. Equilibrium was seconds away. Santiago stared at the display, face pale. "Doc, what happens when it fully equalizes?" I looked at the door, at the cold mist still seeping through the bottom seam, and I understood. It wasn't trying to escape. It was preparing. Equilibrium was seconds away. The pressure readings climbed in unison, room and artifact creeping closer together like two magnets being forced to meet. The numbers pulsed on the screen in time, with the infrasound still shaking faintly through the walls. 14.60 psi, 14.605, 14.608. My breath stuck in my chest. Whatever was inside that stone container had spent thousands of years sealed in an environment that didn't match anything on the surface. A trapped pocket. A void. A chamber that held a pressure so different from ours that releasing it, even slowly, could destabilize the surrounding environment. It wasn't supernatural. It was physics. Stone isn't supposed to hold vacuum. Not for a year, much less millennia. Something about that excavation site had created a hermetic pocket that survived impossibly long. And now it was ending. Santiago grabbed my shoulder. "Doc, evacuating the floor won't be enough. We need to evacuate the building." He was right. My brain knew it. But my legs weren't moving. My eyes locked on the door of Isolation Bay C as the pressure logs blinked again. 14.610 psi, 14.612, 14.613. Then the number froze. Everything froze. For 3 seconds, the hallway went silent. Even the lights seemed to hold their breath. Then, a low, concussive sound rolled through the wall. Not an explosion. There was no heat, no debris. Just a massive internal shift, as if something collapsed inward or buckled under the strain of equalizing pressures. The door to the bay bulged outward a fraction of an inch. Then another. Metal groaned. Santiago swore and stumbled backward, radio already in hand. "Control? Code red in the basement. We need." Static swallowed his voice. The overhead lights flickered once. Twice. They went out. Total blackness. Except a faint glow seeped from under the door to the bay. Not light. More like dense vapor refracting the emergency LED strips from the floor. The same cold mist I'd seen inside. It curled outward, slow and heavy, like exhaling frost. I backed up, pulse pounding behind my eyes. "We need to get upstairs. Now," Santiago said. We turned toward the stairwell, just as footsteps echoed from the opposite direction. Not running, not frantic. Slow, uneven, careful. We both froze. The lights flickered again, weak this time, just enough to paint the end of the hallway in dim color. A figure stepped into view. I didn't breathe. For a moment, my mind leapt to the worst impossible conclusion. But it wasn't something. It was someone. A man. Dust-covered. Jacket torn. Eyes wide and unfocused, like someone who had walked miles through a collapsed shaft. He staggered forward, bracing himself against the wall, coughing hard enough to double over. Santiago raised his flashlight. "Sir? Hey, are you injured?" The man didn't respond verbally, but when he lifted his head, I recognized him immediately. "Dr. Rahim," I whispered. "He shouldn't have been here yet." He said 6 hours. Not 1, not 2, 6. But he was here, chest heaving, face pale as the dust clinging to his clothes. He blinked slowly, then rasped, "Don't open the bay. It's already breaching," I said. Pressure equalized. His expression crumpled. Not fear. Something worse, recognition. "I told them," he whispered. "I told them not to break the slab. It wasn't a coffin. It wasn't a vault. It was a trap." Santiago stepped forward cautiously. "Trap for what?" "For pressure." Rahim's voice shook. "For an entire preserved atmosphere. A paleoclimate pocket. Thousands of years sealed. A perfect vacuum on the inside, perfectly balanced by the weight of the structure around it. Once exposed, it shouldn't have been able to hold. But it did." He coughed again, staggering. "Until now." My skin crawled. "You knew it was destabilizing?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "And we didn't understand how it survived this long. We still don't. But the internal pressure wasn't the danger. It's what the vacuum preserved." I felt my throat close. What did it preserve? His answer wasn't dramatic. It didn't have to be. "Air." Santiago frowned. "Air? Like oxygen?" Air from 10,000 years ago, Rahim said. Unfiltered, unstudied, untreated, unknown. We have no idea what microorganisms existed in that ecosystem, what spores, what compounds. Nothing in that chamber has been exposed to life on the surface since before written history. A preserved pocket of ancient atmosphere. If it equalized, the mist, my blood ran cold. You're saying whatever was sealed inside is now mixing with ours, Rahim said. Yes, not a creature, not a spirit, not a curse. A biological environment older than civilization. A preserved pressure chamber breaking open in the basement of a modern building. The final pulse hit. Not from the artifact this time, from the building. A groaning, settling vibration. The door to isolation bay C dented outward slightly, then cracked along its hinge. A hiss of cold vapor spilled through. Rahim stumbled back. We need to seal off this level. Ventilate. Whatever is in that air cannot spread. Santiago grabbed his arm. Emergency ventilations offline. Powers unstable. Then we lock it down manually, Rahim said. Steel barriers. Chemical traps. Anything. But even as he spoke, the mist thickened under the door. It flowed outward, not fast, but steadily, curling like a fog bank seeking low ground. I backed up until I hit the stair rail. Rahim, how dangerous is that air? He didn't answer right away. In the dim emergency glow, his eyes flicked toward the rising mist. Then he whispered the only answer a scientist afraid of the truth can give. We don't know. The door behind him creaked, and the lid inside the room fell open the rest of the way with a deep, hollow knock. A final surrender to equilibrium. Cold, ancient air, untouched since a world we would never recognize, began pouring into ours. And all we could do was run.